All right, our next speaker is Dr. Matt Akins. He's from University of Wisconsin. He's a dairy extension specialist there. He's going to visit with us about sorghum, I can say this, forage management. Looking forward to hearing his presentation. His area of research is really revolves around forages and dairy replacement heifer development. And so hopefully we'll tie dairy back over in the sorghum forage management, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
First, just want to thank the invitation to come and talk at the conference today. Really good to see everybody back in a room and being able to talk face to face rather than through Zoom. So it's really nice to do that. So kind of just a little background on what I do with sorghum before we get into the actual talk. I mainly look at forage sorghums and other sorghum Sudan grass as a way to find ways to reduce the energy content of the diet rather than increase it, so we don't overcondition dairy heifers before they come into lactation, which is a very common problem if we get into high corn silage diets. A little bit different than with growing cattle, obviously. So we'll try to relate this a bit back to the beef cattle side as well. So a few things we'll go through today. Types of forage sorghum. There's several types of that, and then a lot of traits built into these. So it's a bit confusing when you start looking at seed catalogs and all the different traits that are out there. So we'll go through those, discuss that. Also, planting conditions are really critical to success with sorghums. So you really got to be really watch those soil conditions really closely. They're not going to be as forgiving, say, as with the corn. You really need to watch that close. Seeding rate and method, a bit different between the different sorghum types. So we'll go through that. Fertility needs, going to be variable depending on the sorghum type you use. And then harvesting. We're going to go a little bit about that and different harvesting methods and really how that's going to dictate the quality of that forage and how you might use that in dairy or beef cattle diets. So these are different types of sorghums. I'll group sorghums as forage sorghum, sorghum Sudan grass, and Sudan grass. So forage sorghum is, most of you know what that is. It's going to develop a fairly large grain head. You get a fairly good amount of grain development, fairly thick stalk. It's fairly similar management to corn silage. Usually going to be a one-cut system. Generally not going to be advised to do that as a multi-cut system because you're just not going to get that much regrowth with the forage sorghums. Sorghum Sudan grass has a much thinner stem, much more usable for dry hay or silage or multi-cut systems. So if you do want to look at dry hay production, that's what you're going to want to choose. Sorghum Sudan grass is the hybrid of those two. So it's a little bit more of a moderate stem thickness, really a multifunctional crop. So you can use that as a multi-cut system. So you can take 2 or 3 cuts of that. Or you can let that mature completely and take that off as a single harvest. So it's a bit more versatile type of crop. But generally, sorghum Sudan grass is not going to be, it's going to take a long time for that to become dry hay just because the stems are going to be thicker compared to Sudan grass crop. Within these 3 types, you've got all these different types of traits to choose from. So you have brown midrib, and most of you are probably familiar with that. That's going to decrease the lignin content in the plant, and it's going to increase your fiber digestibility. So if you're looking to feed this to, let's say, growing cattle, lactating dairy cows, that's going to be something you want to look for is that brown midrib trait because you're going to try to improve that fiber digestibility of that forage. Photoperiod sensitives becoming more popular. And what that is, it's a trait in the plant that the the plant will not become reproductive until the daylight hours become less than about 12 and a half hours per day. So usually that's going to be happening in mid to late September, depending on your area. So that plant will continue to be vegetative growth throughout that whole growing season. So the forage yield produced can be fairly high from those varieties. The problem with that is you want to do a single harvest system, getting that stuff to dry down is a real difficulty in the fall. You have to rely on frost conditions, and you have to let it sit out there for maybe a week to 2 weeks and pray that you don't have a snow or lodging or wind. And then you can run into some lodging issues, and we've had that happen with some of our larger field experiments. So you're kind of playing with the weather a little bit when you decide to do a single cut system with a photosensitive type. That's a bit. We've had one experiment with a 10-acre field, where the entire field we were gonna use that as a feeding experiment, and the entire thing went down in like early November after we got some windstorm and snow on top of it. It was a pretty bad disaster. So we had to delay that feeding trial to the next year. Brachytic dwarfs, that's really kind of a really potentially useful trait, especially in forage sorghums. So what that is, it's a reduced internode length in between the leaves. So you're gonna have a shorter stature crop, greater leaf content, greater leaf to stem ratio with that. And your lodging is gonna probably be less with those types. So if you're gonna be looking at a forage sorghum and you're really worried about lodging, that's potentially a trait that you might wanna look at using. Male sterile is exactly that. The pollen is not going to be active, so you end up with virtually no grain development in the forage. So if you're looking for a really high fiber plant or forage, that's a fairly useful trait to have. So you can let that completely mature, and you're not going to have any grain development with that. So for heifers, dairy heifers, that can work really well. And maybe for like beef cow production. And then lastly, this dry stalk trait, I think, could be really, really useful if you're worried about harvesting in the fall with a single cut system, because it's going to drop your moisture content by about 2 to 5 percentage points. So it could be the difference between a really wet type of silage or fairly really silage you want to be looking at in that 30 to 40% range. So that's a trait that you might want to look at if you're looking to, if you're worried about getting it too wet in the fall. All right, next we'll move on to planting conditions. And if you guys have any questions, we can take those as we go through rather than waiting them. Yeah.
What was the time period you were saying that the dry stalk would drop to the dry matter?
Usually the difference between a dry stalk and a non-dry stalk is going to be 2 to 5 percentage points
In what time frame?
at similar reproductive stages. So planting conditions, as I mentioned before, are going to be really critical, and we've run into problems with this in Wisconsin, especially in central Wisconsin. We have fairly wet, heavy soils, and if we get that planted in to a wet, cool soil, it takes a long time for that seed to germinate, or if it germinates at all. So you want to be putting this into a drier condition, soils, well-drained. You want to be waiting until that soil gets to at least 60 degrees minimum temperature. So in the morning, you want to be going out and getting temperatures on that soil instead of in the afternoon. You want to get that. If that temperature is not at least 60 degrees, the germination is going to be really poor with sorghums. So in Wisconsin, that's usually going to be in early June, at least in our area. In central Wisconsin, if you go to southern Wisconsin, that might be in late May or early June, depending on the soil type. And if you have any inclination that you're going to have a heavy rainfall coming that around planting, you're going to want to think about delaying planting, because especially being a tilled situation, if you go through there and it's fairly loose soil and you plant that, you get a heavy rain, that's going to basically crust over, and that the germination is going to be pretty awful. All right, so you're going to end up with a lot of weed pressure in those fields due to crusting. As far as no-till or tillage systems, we've had pretty good luck with no-till systems going into like cereal grain forage. So after we take off rye or trit, we've had farms go directly in there, usually put manure on first, and then they'll come in and no-till that in right into that cereal grain forage. And that's a pretty nice system. They'll take that cereal forage off, and that usually for lactating cows, it's going to be in that boot stage. And then they'll come in and no-till that in, usually for heifer feed. As far as planting depth, that's really critical. You don't want to be getting this stuff too deep. So you want to be in that 3/4 to at most a 1/2 inch on your heavier soils. On your sandy soils, you can get a little bit deeper and it's a little more forgiving, but you still probably want to be making sure you're reaching moisture at least with that seed. But you don't want to get that too deep, especially in your heavier soils. So you want to be making sure to check your drill depths and your planting depths pretty closely. Just from experience, we've planted ours with a no-till drill, and we get it much past an inch deep, and it's kind of really pretty poor stands. As far as rate of seeding and method, your forage sorghums are going to be pretty low seeding rates. Recommendations, a lot of our plot work was based on about 100,000 seeds planted per acre. A lot of the seed companies are coming back and trying to back those down now, because if you get too high seeding rates, you're going to get thinner stems, and that's going to lead to lodging. So more companies are starting to back that down to 60 to 80,000 seeds per acre. So that's going to run 4, 5, 6 pounds usually of seed per acre, because it's about 12 to 15,000 seeds per pound for forage sorghum. So it's pretty low seeding rate. So a grain drill is really hard to calibrate at 4 to 6, maybe 8 pounds of seed per acre. Really difficult to get that calibrated in at that. So this is where a planter, if you want to go wide row spacing, 20 to 30 inches, which is probably typical or recommended for forage sorghum, a planter is really where that would be most optimal to use. Grain drill, it's really hard to get that. You're going to have a lot of gaps in between the seed and between the plants. You're going to get weed pressure potentially. So I would recommend using a planter for that. Now with your sorghum, Sudan grass, a grain drill can work very well, because you're going to be in that 15 to 30 pound range with those. And you can vary the row spacing between, most of our work's at 15-inch rows, but you can also do it at narrow rows too. So there's some flexibility as far as how you manage this. Now, fertility, there's a lot of talk about nitrogen earlier. Fertility is really key with this, just like with corn. Nitrogen's going to be really important with these. So typical nitrogen recommendations for forage sorghums are going to be about 100 to 150 pounds of N per acre as the typical recommendations. Based on some data from in the south, done in Texas, it's about 25% less than, say, for corn silage. But you can back off the nitrogen a little bit compared to corn silage. One thing to consider is if you have nitrogen credits. In Wisconsin, we got a lot of alfalfa grown. So if we have a winter-killed alfalfa stand and they put in sorghum, we're going to use those nitrogen credits to back off that nitrogen use. But I don't know how much alfalfa is grown in Nebraska or in this area of the country, but if you have soybeans, possibly you might be able to take a little bit of a nitrogen credit. But that's something to consider. But you do need nitrogen to really have a good crop, an aggressively grown crop. So typically with a single harvest system, you'd apply that mostly all pre-plant. At least that's how we typically operate. Now your multi-cut system, you're going to want to space those nitrogen applications with each harvest. So it's not going to uptake all that nitrogen in that first cutting. Typically for each harvest, it's going to be 40 to 60 pounds of N per harvest. Usually kind of the general benchmark is about a pound and a half of nitrogen per growing day between harvests is the general recommendation. Now there's some data from Cornell that's recommended higher, so some work from Tom Kilster that he's recommending a bit higher rates of 75 to 100 pounds of nitrogen. And what that's really doing is trying to increase the protein content for use in dairy cattle diets is what the main driver there is. But that's probably, this year, I don't know if I'd recommend to do that much. But something to consider is if you have to feed a bean meal or other protein supplements, is what's going to be the effect of that nitrogen on the protein of that crop? What's the cost? So what's your recovery of protein from that compared to having to buy in protein from bean meal or distillers or other protein supplements? So that's something you got to think about when we apply nitrogen to these plants, is you're recouping that as protein. So you're going to buy it on the front end as nitrogen and fertility, or you're going to have to buy it on the back end as protein supplementation, depending on if you're feeding dairy cattle, it's a bit different, but beef cattle, you're not feeding 16, 17% protein diets. So really dependent on your system. And lastly, potassium. Potassium, it will take a lot of potassium up. So I don't know in the soils around here, are they low or high in potassium? I don't know if you have issues with potassium or not, but we generally do in Wisconsin. And so we have to usually fertilize with potassium so we don't draw down our potassium too much. But it will take a significant amount of potassium. Usually it's about 2 to 3% potassium on a dry matter basis in these forages. So they do accumulate a large amount of potassium. I want to talk a little bit about irrigation. I'm not an agronomist or a water specialist by any means, but we've done some work with this at Hancock in Wisconsin. It's a location in the central sands area of Wisconsin where they grow a lot of vegetables. Everything is irrigated, all very sandy soils. So really an ideal location to look at irrigation effects. What we did was we had corn, forage sorghum, and three different types of forage sorghum. As a conventional forage sorghum, a BMR, and a photosensitive type. Then we had 2 different types of sorghum sudangrass, a conventional and a BMR type, and then a photosensitive type as well. So this is 2016 data. So you can see the corn, and this year we had very unusual pattern of rainfall, very consistent. We would get every 3 to 4 days, we'd get a good rainfall across the entire season, or most of the season. So our zero rate yields, so our non-rain-fed, our rain-fed plots had pretty good yields, from 6 tons up to almost 10 to 12 tons of dry matter on a zero rate, non-rain-fed, on a extremely sandy soil. So very unusual year that we had that year. You'll see the next slide, completely different year. We had a lot of areas of times when we had a very low rainfall coming. But you can see we had pretty good response in the corn. So it went from 6 tons in the rain-fed up to 10 tons at the 100% rate. And the way they irrigated these plots, it was all based on the corn rate. So they irrigated based on the corn, and then we backed it off 25 percentage units to get the 3 reduced rates. So you can see a pretty good linear effect of irrigation for the corn. But you can see on the sorghums, you get to a certain point and we start to reach some plateau and about 50 to 75% for most of these. So we see a really good effect, especially for this BMR sorghum, especially these photosensitive sorghums. Photosensitive sorghums, remember, they don't stop growing until really like mid to late September. So the forage yield potential on those is pretty exceptional. And you can see that this is the photosensitive forage sorghum and then the photosensitive sorghum Sudan grass. Very good yield production across those different irrigation rates. The sorghum Sudan grass is a little different growing development. So both of those, they're going to at least at some point stop growing. They're going to head out and have a more limited yield potential for those. So after about 60, 70 days, they're going to start to become reproductive and have a less yield accumulation. So that's why we don't see the yield response to those for the different different irrigation rates. But you can see in a normal year, we were a little bit above our normal precipitation. And then we irrigated about 12 inches on our 100% rate, and then progressively less irrigation across the other rates based on the corn rate. Now, if we go to 2017, the next year, much lower yields for the rain-fed plots. Corn was at about 4 tons. The rest of these were maybe 2 to 3 tons. Those plots looked so awful. It was really pathetic. We had several stretches of time where a week to 2 weeks where it didn't rain. So the growth during that period was very minimal. So the actual overall precipitation was fairly similar to the previous year. We just came in big bulks, which what we're starting to see now. The last several years, we're starting to see these rains come in 1, 2, 3 inch rains at one time, and then we won't have rain for another week and a half. So we're having longer stretches in between rainfalls, but that water that's available in the profile is probably less as it's draining through. So it's really interesting. And as we irrigated, we did see a pretty good response with the corn, as we'd expect. Similar yields to the previous year, about 10 tons, but less response in the sorghums. So again, right around 50% of the corn irrigation is where it kind of tapped off and didn't see much of a response in additional water to those sorghums. So they are generally more responsive to irrigation, and they generally require about 25% water or less water than like a corn crop, based on some data from Texas. So they generally are going to be more water use efficient. As far as harvest management, this is going to become where you're going to dictate where you might use these and what kind of animals you might be feeding them is really critical. A multi-harvest system is going to be a generally higher fiber digestibility, higher protein crop. And usually in the Midwest, in Wisconsin, Minnesota, we're going to see two harvests are really probably pretty common. We won't get more than that. In this area, you get a bit more growing degree days in maybe the late fall, so you might be able to get a third harvest. But this is kind of the time frame that we use. So typically, our soils are ready to plant in early to mid-June. That's when they're going to hit that target of 60 degrees. We're going to plant that, and then usually take that first cutting about 40 to 45 days post-planting when it's ready. And we target about 30 to 40 inches for lactating dairy cows is kind of the target. If we get anything above that, our fiber really starts to get high and our fiber digestibility crashes. So it really doesn't fit well both lactating dairy cow diets. Also, if you wait too long here, you're cutting too late, and then it sets up your second harvest too late, and then your second harvest is going to be really pretty poor too. You got to think about that. If you cut a little bit early, it's going to set up a little bit better for your second cutting. For your second cutting, there's really two options here. You can either take that off at mid to late September, is what we do. We're going to cut and wilt that and chop it. And then what that does, and what really fits pretty well, is you can then put a cover, like a cereal grain harvest or cereal grain crop in after that. So rye or trit are pretty useful. So you can get that, again, that double cropping system back in effect. The other option is you can wait until mid to late October to maybe accumulate a little bit more forage yield. Quality is going to be a little bit less, but you're going to have to depend on a frost to kill that off. And then actually, after a frost, you can almost come in and direct harvest that. It'll dry down to 30, 40% after a killing frost. The leaves will all die, as you can see. You can see it completely browns the leaves. And then by that point, about 7 days after the killing frost, that will be almost a perfect dry matter to direct harvest that off. The other option is a single harvest system, which is basically a corn silage type system. You're really going to maximize your yield. So typically with a single harvest system, you're going to have 2 to 3 times the yield as compared to a multi-harvest system. You're going to definitely have a bit lower quality forage, but in a beef cattle system, this is probably what is going to be used the most. You're not looking for really super high quality feed like lactating cows. So that's probably what most dairy or most beef producers would use. And as far as a beef feedlot system, or a beef cow system, it probably would look at a forage sorghum as being fairly ideal. It fits pretty well with similar to corn silage management system. You don't need to deal with cutting and wilting. Say if you use sorghum Sudan grass, so forage sorghum probably would fit pretty well instead of corn silage. One thing to consider is depending on what type of forage sorghum you use, like a photosensitive type, you're going to have to let that freeze and wilt. So I probably would not suggest doing that from my bad experience. You're really setting yourself up for some frustration with harvesting, waiting to harvest that. So typically, again, we're going to plant in early to mid-June. You can cut and wilt this stuff. I'll show you some pictures of what we've done at Marshfield of that type of system. Or we can let that fully mature and cut that in. Usually that's going to be mature in middle of October, depending on the variety you choose. There's a lot of different days to maturity that are out there, from 80, 100-day maturities that you can select from. So if you're worried at all about the maturity and getting that off sooner, you might go with an earlier type of maturity rather than a later. So that's also something to consider. So this is a field that we planted in 2018 after our disaster in 2017. So we planted this actually on July 4th, a bit later than we wanted to. We had to wait a bit of time for the field to get prepped, get manure on it. So ideally, this would have been planted about a month earlier. It just didn't work into the farm staff didn't have enough time because they were busy with getting first crop off. That year was pretty rough with getting first crop off. So it delayed getting this in the field. So, but you can see within, this is about 2 weeks after, it's coming up pretty nice. Within a month of that, it's coming really pretty thick. And by late September, when we cut it, the stuff's about 5-6 feet tall, really nice, pretty nice crop. They went and cut it that day, just with a hay bind with a roller crimper. They did condition that. Ideally, this will be laid out a bit wider than in that picture. They would open that up and let that to dry it out a little faster. because, see, they cut it on September 22nd. We didn't actually harvest that until 3 days later. So this stuff takes a while to dry down. And that was a warm stretch of weather. That was 70, 80-degree weather in September, which we usually don't get in Wisconsin. So it does take time to dry. So you want to wide spot that stuff to dry it faster. And then we came back and picked it up with the hay head to chop it. That field averaged about 2.5 to 3 tons of dry matter per acre from that field. That stuff, again, was about 5 feet tall. That's, if we would have planted that another 3 weeks before that, we probably would have seen at least another 2 to 3 tons more dry matter, just a lot more accumulation of feed from that. It never headed out yet, so it had a lot of room for additional yield potential from that. So that system is, if you're going to do a single cut system in the fall and you want to put in cereal forage after that, that's what you're going to have to probably do, unless you get a really short day forage sorghum. As far as yields, as I mentioned before, if that multi-harvest system is going to really drastically decrease your yield potential by about half, especially for forage sorghum. Again, you're not going to want to use a multi-cut system with forage sorghum. It's just not built for that. It's really built for a single cut system. But the sorghum sedans can work pretty well with the multi-cut system. You do see a bit of a yield reduction, but not as much as you do with that forage sorghum. Typical yields that we see in a year for multi-cut is going to be 4 to 6 tons of dry matter. Typical for forage single cut system, depending on your soil types. If you have a wetter soil, it's probably 4 to 6. For a nice dry soil, really good conditions, you're talking 7, 8 to 10 tons of dry matter is what we've seen in good situations. And you can see that's the H. That's at Hancock in those really dry, sandy soils. They really perform pretty well in those conditions. They don't like wet conditions. We have kind of the two extremes in this figure showing that marshfield soil is really wet and a difficult one to manage with sorghums. Next, we'll talk a little bit about quality and between the two harvest types. So you can see the multi-system, generally very little variation between that as far as fiber, from 63 to 65% NDF. Compared to the single cut system, we see a much less fiber. What that plant's actually doing, which is really unique, when you let that go in the fall, it actually accumulates a large amount of sugars. It'll go through a hardening process when you get cold weather, especially after a frost or two. It'll actually start to accumulate a large amount of sugars in that plant. So that's a good thing for energy and a good thing for fermentation to a certain point, because excess sugars can actually be detrimental at some point for stability, is what we have seen, depending on the inoculant you use and the silage management. As far as TDN values, again, actually, pretty good TDN values here for the multi-cut system. 63 to 66%, maybe a bit higher. Actually, fairly similar across the multi-cuts. When we go to singles cut system, that forage sorghum is going to be generally quite a bit less than corn silage. Usually about, on a percentage basis, about 10 to 15% lower energy for the sorghums than, say, with corn silage. So you do take a reduction in energy. But when we look at the BMR types, we do see a bit of a bump here. So about 2 to 5% improvement in TDN values due to that fiber digestibility. Again, if you're looking to feed growing cattle, that BMR trait might be something to look at to improve that fiber digestibility. So a little bit on forage sorghum silage. This is going to, again, probably the most popular thing that you might use in this area. Again, similar to corn silage. And management as far as silage is going to be fairly similar to corn silage. You're going to manage probably in that 65% moisture range would be really ideal. And that's going to be usually in that mid to late soft dough stage. And you don't want to let it go to hard dough because that berry, once it reaches hard dough, that berry becomes very hard and is not going to process when you chop that. So you're not going to get a lot of energy out of those berries if it reaches that hard dough stage. Processing is very important, and it's very difficult because those berries are much smaller than a corn kernel. Some work from Florida that Luis Ferreto's done has shown that it's really, even when you get that thing down to 1 millimeter on the kernel processor, the breakage on those berries is actually not a lot. So it's very hard to break those berries. So you want to try to, again, take it off at that soft dough stage to try to get that starch as much as digestible as you can. Well, it should be better than hard dough stage, definitely. Yeah, the question was, if you take it off at that soft dough stage, will you get better starch digestibility? Yeah, much better than hard dough stage is what I would have to say. You don't want to be once those berries get hard dough, they're like little BBs. They're not going to process, and they're going to go right through the animal. And that's what you're depending on. If you're looking to let it go that far, you're really depending on that starch as a source of energy, not just on the fiber. Let's see, I need to go cut through these a little bit quick for time. I talked a little bit about this earlier. We're going to skip this because I'm running short on time. But we can use these in lactating cow diets. They can be pretty effective. Most of the work's done with replacing it with corn silage, seeing actually pretty favorable effects. A little bit lower intakes, but as far as the milk solids produced, is actually pretty similar. Usually milk fat will go up because of the increase in the fiber that's being digested. So it's actually pretty favorable use of sorghums in lactating cow diets. As far as in use in beef cattle diets, these can be a fairly good source, especially for beef cows. Energy might be a bit higher than desirable, so you may have to blend it with some lower quality hay depending upon the situation for those cows. But probably will need a protein supplement because most of those protein levels in those single harvest systems are going to be 5, 6, 7% protein, so it's probably a bit low than, say, even for beef cows. As far as for growing cattle and feedlot cattle, it can actually work pretty well. So for the growing cattle, as far as on a high forage feeding diet, I would probably look at using that BMR trait. Really going to improve the fiber digestibility and energy content of that and have less of an influence on the fill effect. As far as feeding potential in feedlot diets, as a roughage source, it probably worked very well at 10, 15% of the diet just as a fiber source. So I think that would work actually pretty effectively. There are some special considerations with sorghum. So one of them is nitrate. Nitrates can get out of hand, especially if you over-fertilize with nitrogen, which probably won't be as much of an issue this year as in maybe previous years. But they are a problem in drought-stricken areas. So when that plant basically shuts down, that it's still going to pull some nitrate out, so then that nitrate's not converted to protein. and gets captured in the stem. Most of it's found in the lower part of the stem. So luckily, if that happens, if we do know we have some nitrate potential, we can raise that cutter head a bit to basically leave some of those nitrates in the field if we want. And these do not dissipate unless you have unless you have a period of time where after a drought where you do get some rain, and then those nitrates will be taken up and reconverted to protein. But if you have a period of time, say after a frost, where you have nitrate accumulation, those nitrates will stay in that plant. So that's something to consider after a fall harvest. For a fall harvest, if you do depend on a frost killing, you may have potential risk of nitrates. Luckily, in a single harvest system, usually you don't see really high rates of nitrates. Usually it's found in more of your younger vegetative material. And silage fermentation can help a little bit with that. It can reduce it by about a third up to a half of the nitrates in that. But I would have to stress, if you are worried about nitrates, the nitrate test at any lab is very economical. We're talking $10 to $20. Right? That's well worth the price of testing the silage compared to the loss of an animal. So I would definitely send a sample to the lab to get tested before you start feeding this out.
Question?
Yeah.
Do you see occurrence of silo gas more often in silage than in
Yeah, I can't really talk about that too much, but yeah, high nitrate forages are probably more at risk for nitrous oxide gases. So that's a good, yeah. Oh, the question was, do high nitrate sorghums, are they at more risk for nitrogen gases in the silo? So potentially, yeah. I don't have direct knowledge of that, but it would make sense that high nitrate forages would potentially off-gas more of those nitrous gases. So you do need to be careful with that, especially in enclosed spaces. But good question. And these are just some guidelines. So again, if you send a sample into the lab, you do need to interpret those. And these are from the University of Wisconsin, but similar to other universities' recommendations as well, you can find. But the one thing to consider is how the test results come out, whether it's nitrate, nitrogen, or just nitrate. So that's really important to interpret those correctly, because it'll drastically affect how you potentially manage that forage. So just something to consider is what's the actual units for the measurement. The next one is prussic acid or hydrogen cyanide. This is mostly a problem in our frosted type forages. So after a frost, we get rupture of cells. That cyanide, the glycoside durin is then converted to hydrogen cyanide in the leaf material. So usually after 7 to 10 days, after the leaves become brown and dry, that's dissipated, it's evaporated. So it's generally not a large concern if you let that completely dry down. The big risk is with grazing. I think Mary did a nice talk with this last year at a meeting, that if you do intend to graze it after potentially a frost, that is going to be a major risk. So you need to consider that if you're going to graze these sorghum forages. All right, so I think in summary, I'm going to kind of skip the summary. And I guess if there's any questions, I don't want to get too much over on time here, so I have enough time for John. I don't want to cut into his time at all. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly the rate at which it accumulates. I think it's pretty rapid though.
Yeah.
Within a day. So.
Usually by the time we catch it, I'm like,
well, if you didn't catch it by now, but that's something to consider though, is if you have an anticipated frost event, you probably want to pull those animals off that. Yeah. Because it will, the process of by the time they eat that forage, until the actual symptoms come is very rapid.
So
Like,
you think it'd be like an overnight?
yeah, but the thing is with that, you can manage it. So you can basically force them to eat the entire plant because it's most of it's in the leaf material. So if you have a more aggressive grazing strategy to force them to eat the stem, it'll dilute out that. So they're not going to take as much of that prussic acid in. So that'd be what I would probably do is force them to eat the stem material. So, or pull them off. Or you have another feed available to help dilute out that. So, but yeah, that prussic acid nitrate is something to consider as a risk factor. So.
All right, let's thank our speaker.